In a dimension beyond our time, in a place we call the Land of Uz, arose the life of a man whose existence was, in itself, a testimony. His name, Job, became synonymous not only with suffering, but with an almost mythical integrity, a righteousness that seemed to belong to a purer age. He was not a good man out of convenience. He was the embodiment of the fear of God, a profound reverence that made him shun evil not for fear of punishment, but for love of purity. His life was a reflection of this alliance with the divine. In human eyes, he was the epitome of success, a giant whose possessions stretched beyond the reach of the eye. 7,000 sheep dotted his hills like white clouds. 3,000 camels formed caravans that were the envy of merchants, and 500 yoke of oxen plowed his fertile fields, ensuring crops that fed many. His wealth was not just a number. It was an ecosystem of prosperity that benefited his entire household and community. He was, without exaggeration, the greatest and most respected man in all the East. However, Job's true treasure lay not in his barns or flocks. It resided within the walls of his home, in the sound of the laughter of his 10 children. 7 sons and 3 daughters who not only shared the same blood, but also a genuine communion. They celebrated life with frequent banquets, a tradition that strengthened their bonds and filled the home with joy. Job observed this harmony with a grateful but also vigilant heart. His faith did not allow him to be complacent. At the end of each cycle of feasts, even before the sun rose above the horizon, he would rise in silence. He would go to his private altar and with moving solemnity offer a burnt offering for each of his children. In his mind, a thought persisted. Perhaps in their hearts, in a moment of euphoria, my children sinned. Perhaps they harbored a frivolous thought against God. This ritual was not the fruit of superstition, but of deep zeal, the expression of a father who desired to present his family pure and unblemished before the Creator. He understood that true purity resided in the heart, a fortress that he, as guardian of his home, sought to protect with prayers and sacrifices. His life, therefore, was a perfect balance between material blessings and spiritual devotion. Nothing seemed out of place. Peace reigned in his fields, health in his family, respect in his community. In the eyes of the world, Job's life was an unshakable fortress, a living testament to the fact that righteousness was rewarded with peace. But what human eyes could not see, what no earthly wisdom could foresee, was that the central stage of Job's story was not in Uz. It was mounted on a celestial sphere beyond the veil of physical reality. While Job prayed, while his sons celebrated, a cosmic assembly gathered. The Bible reveals to us a glimpse of this transcendental scene, a day when the sons of God, angelic beings, presented themselves before the Lord's throne to give an account of their missions. And infiltrated among them with a presence that contrasted with the heavenly light was Satan. His name means the accuser, and his office is precisely this: to roam creation not to admire, but to find fault, to test the limits of faith, to expose hypocrisy. The Lord, sovereign and omniscient, unsurprised by any presence, began the dialogue with a question that, though simple, was charged with depth. Where do you come from? The accuser's answer was icy and revealing of his wandering and searching nature, from going to and fro in the earth and walking up and down in it. He was the cynical observer, the inspector of souls, always searching for a chink in the armor of faith. It was then that God himself, with a confidence that honored his servant, brought a name into that heavenly conversation, a name that shone on earth and echoed in heaven. Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil. It was the highest of honors, a testament directly from the Creator to a mortal's character. But the essence of the accuser is to doubt, to poison purity with suspicion. With sarcastic audacity, Satan retorted, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Is his faith selfless?" He issued the challenge, the accusation that would become the engine of the entire tragedy. Have you not surrounded him with a wall of protection, him, his house, and all that he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions are as numerous as the sand of the seashore. But stretch out your hand and remove this hedge of blessings, and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. The accusation was twofold. Job's faith was mercenary, a mere commercial transaction where devotion was payment for blessings received. And by extension, it was an affront. It addresses God himself, suggesting that the love of his creatures needed to be purchased by prosperity. God, in his unfathomable wisdom, accepted the challenge, not out of doubt, but to reveal a deeper truth. The trust he placed in Job was as real as Job's faith in him. With calm authority, the Lord established the limits of the test. Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only against himself do not stretch out your hand. In that instant, in the solemn silence of the heavenly court, Job's fate was sealed, not by divine whim, but by a permission meant to reveal the indestructible nature of genuine faith. Satan departed not with the joy of a victor, but with the eagerness of a destroyer, authorized to dismantle, piece by piece, Job's perfect world, his wealth, his servants, his family, everything except his life. A storm of unimaginable proportions was gathering on the horizon of a life of a man who, in his innocence, continued to pray, unaware that his faith was about to become the central stage in a battle between heaven and hell. The story that would be told for millennia would begin, not with pain, but with this conversation, with this challenge that would challenge not just one man, but the very essence of the relationship between creator and creature. The stage was set. The first act of the ordeal was about to begin.
The day that would change everything began as banally as ever. The sun of Uz rose in the sky, painting the landscape with hues of gold and promising another day of peace and productivity. Job's servants were already at work, the oxen plowing the land in perfect furrows, the sheep scattered across the hills, and in the eldest son's house, the family celebration continued its joyful course. Job, faithful to his routine, likely reflected in silence, his heart in tune with God, planning the next day's sacrifices. There was an order, a comforting predictability in his life. But that order was about to be shattered by the invisible hand of chaos. Heavenly permission had been given, and the accuser would not waste a second. The first wave of the storm came from the south. A servant, the sole survivor of his group, appeared on the horizon, not walking, but running desperately. His face was covered in dust and sweat, his eyes wide with the horror he had witnessed. He burst before Job, breathless, his voice cracking as he tried to form words. "My lord," he choked, "the oxen were plowing the land, the donkeys were grazing peacefully beside them, when out of nowhere the Sabaeans attacked us." He described a sudden, violent, and relentless attack. They took all the animals and put the servants to the sword. Only I managed to escape to bring you the news." Job barely had time to process the magnitude of the loss. Hundreds of animals, the pillar of his farming, and dozens of loyal servants' lives taken in a single attack. His mind tried to comprehend, to calculate the damage, to absorb the shock, but reality refused to give him respite. Before the first messenger could finish his sentence, a second was already there, his appearance even more terrifying. His clothes were singed, his face stained with soot. He spoke not of men, but of a force that seemed to come from above. "Fire from God has fallen from heaven," he cried, his voice cracking with panic. "It has fallen on the sheep and the shepherds. It has consumed everything, my lord. 7,000 sheep and all the men who tended them, all died. I am the only one left to tell the tale." The expression, "fire from God," was used to describe a lightning strike, a natural catastrophe of divine proportions. For Job, a man of faith, the news was doubly crushing. It wasn't just the loss of his immense wealth of wool and flocks. It was the terrifying suggestion that the fury seemed to come from the very heavens he so revered. The confusion in his heart deepened, mingling with the growing pain. But the avalanche of misfortunes had not yet ceased. Like a nightmare that refuses to end, a third man appeared, stumbling, wounded, his gaze lost in space. "The Chaldeans," he whispered. "They organized themselves into 3 groups. They attacked by surprise and took all the camels. They killed the servants who tried to resist. Once again, I alone survived to bring the report." 3,000 camels. His main source of transportation, of trade, the symbol of his status as the greatest man in the East, all gone. In a matter of minutes, Job's economic structure, built over a lifetime of honest and blessed labor, had imploded. He had gone from a tycoon to a man with almost no possessions. The pain of material loss was immense, but still bearable for a man of his spiritual stature. He knew that riches come and go, but the accuser had saved the cruelest blow, the most devastating weapon, for last. The fourth messenger did not run. He staggered, as if each step were torture. His face expressed not panic, but a silent, deep pain, a pain that seemed to have broken something inside him. He stood before Job, and for a moment, the silence was heavier than any scream. Then his voice choked with sobs he couldn't contain. He spoke the words that would split Job's world in 2. "Your sons and your daughters," he began, his voice breaking. "They were all together in their eldest brother's house, eating, drinking, celebrating as always." He paused, gathering his strength to deliver the final sentence. Then a mighty wind, a hurricane from the desert, struck the 4 corners of the house. It couldn't hold. The structure gave way and collapsed on them all. The messenger looked at Job, the tears finally flowing freely. "No one survived, my lord. They all died. I was the only one outside and escaped to tell him." 10 children. The entirety of his offspring. The laughter, the voices, the dreams, the future, all buried beneath the rubble of a house. This was not a loss that could be calculated. It was a void that opened in the soul, an abyss from which no sound returns. No parent is prepared to bury a child, much less 10 at once. The pain was absolute, a dark, infinite ocean. In that instant, the world would have expected a collapse, a scream of fury against God, an accusation of injustice. The accuser, in the unseen background, was surely smiling, waiting for the blasphemy that would prove his point. But what Job did next shocked heaven, silenced hell, and redefined the nature of faith for all future generations. He rose from the ground. With a solemnity that contrasted with the chaos around him, he performed the rites of the deepest mourning. He tore his robe, a symbol of a broken heart. He shaved his head, a sign of utter humiliation and surrender. And then he prostrated himself, face down in the dust of the earth that had just swallowed his hopes. But he did not fall into despair.
he bowed in worship, and with a firm voice which pierced the silence of tragedy, he made his immortal declaration: "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." The Bible makes a point of recording, as a seal of victory in that first round of spiritual warfare, "In all this, Job did not sin, nor did he charge God with wrongdoing." The enemy's first attack had failed miserably. Job's fortress, built not on blessings, but on trust in the character of the giver, remained standing, wounded but unshaken. The secret of his resilience was still hidden, but its first layer had been revealed: a faith that worships even in absence.
Job's victory in the first round of his trial echoed in the heavenly courts, but the battle for his soul was far from over. The resilience of a righteous man in the face of total loss did not satisfy the accuser's cynicism. On the contrary, it only instigated him to deepen the wound. A new heavenly assembly was formed. The sons of God once again presented themselves before the Lord's throne, and among them, punctual and defiant, stood Satan. The scene repeated itself, but the tension was greater. God, knowing what was going on in the enemy's heart, initiated the dialogue, extolling his servant's unshakable integrity. "Have you considered my servant Job?" he asked, his tone mingled with pride and veiled defiance. "There was none like him on earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil. And he still holds fast his integrity, though you incite me against him to destroy him without cause." God's words were a powerful statement. Job's faith was not superficial, not tied to his circumstances. He had lost everything, and yet his heart remained faithful. But the accuser's mind is adept at finding new fronts of attack. He disdained Job's first victory, treating the loss of his possessions and children as a mere scratch. With cold, cruel logic, he presented his new argument: skin for skin. All that a man has will he give in exchange for his life. He suggested that man is, at his very core, selfish, that he would endure the loss of loved ones and wealth as long as his own physical integrity was preserved. It was a profound indictment of human nature, reducing love and loyalty to a simple survival instinct. "But stretch out your hand," Satan proposed, "and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." The new challenge was direct, intimate, and visceral. The next attack would not be against what Job possessed, but against what he was, his own body, his temple of flesh and blood. God, in his sovereignty, and with the same unshakable confidence in the spiritual fiber of his servant, granted permission, establishing a final and insurmountable limit. "Behold, he is in your power, but spare his life." With this authorization, Satan descended to earth no longer as a thief stealing from afar, but as a disease infiltrating the bloodstream. Without delay, Job's body, once healthy and vigorous, became the epicenter of a terrible affliction. The Bible describes it as granulosores, painful ulcers, inflamed pustules that erupted all over his skin, from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. It was no mere skin disease, it was constant agony. The itching was a relentless torture, the wounds opened and festered, and the smell of disease enveloped him like a funeral pall. The man who had once been admired for his poise and vitality was now a vision of horror and revulsion. Without the strength to stand, he dragged himself out of his now empty home and sat on a mound of ash, the symbol of his mourning and now of his own physical degradation. There,
Amid the rubble of his former life, he picked up a shard of pottery, a piece of broken clay, and with it, he scraped his wounds in a vain attempt to ease the pain that consumed him day and night. The scene was a picture of utter desolation. A body in ruins, a heart already shattered by loss, and a mind struggling to find a shred of meaning amidst the chaos. And it was at this point of extreme vulnerability, when physical pain added to the pain of his soul, that Job's solitude was shattered by the most unexpected, and perhaps for that reason, the most cutting voice, the voice of his wife. She too had lost her 10 children, who saw her husband, the pillar of her life, disintegrating before her eyes. She approached, but on her lips were no words of comfort. They were the poison of accumulated despair. Seeing Job's wretched state, her inner strength gave way. She no longer saw the man of integrity. She only saw endless suffering. And with a mixture of anger, exhaustion, and perhaps a distorted compassion, she uttered the sentence, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." The words were razor-sharp. The suggestion was not just to give up faith, but life itself. Dying seemed to her the only possible release from that hell on earth. It was the cry of someone who could no longer bear to witness the pain of those he loved, a pain that seemed to prove their fidelity was for naught. The blow was brutal. In his hour of greatest need, when a whisper of comfort could be worth more than all the gold in the world, Job received an invitation to apostasy and suicide. But even there, covered in wounds, reeking of death, his heart bleeding from the betrayal of his wife's despair, the rock of Job's faith did not break. He looked at her, not with anger, but with profound sadness, and his response was yet another lesson of wisdom forged in the fire. "You speak like one of the foolish women. Shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil?" Once again, the Bible records his victory. In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. He understood that his covenant with God was not a contract of well-being. It was a relationship of sovereignty and trust, which held firm in both abundance and poverty. But Job's trial was about to enter a new phase, perhaps the most complex of all. The physical attack had failed to break his faith, but now suffering would take on a more subtle and equally torturous form, the form of human judgment, of comfort that accuses, of friendship that wounds. On the horizon, 3 friends approached, bringing with them not healing, but the weight of their own theologies. The blow to the soul was about to be struck. Job's loneliness was about to become even more profound.
News of a tragedy of the magnitude that befell Job travels like the desert wind, reaching the farthest corners of the earth. And so the story of his downfall reached the ears of his 3 closest friends, men of wisdom and renown in their respective regions. Eliphaz the Temanite, the oldest and perhaps the most thoughtful, whose wisdom was based on observation and spiritual experience. Bildad the Shuhite, a staunch traditionalist, a man whose worldview was shaped by the sayings of the ancients and an unyielding logic of cause and effect. And Zophar the Naamathite, the most impetuous and passionate of the trio, a man of direct and fervent words, who did not hesitate to express his convictions with brutal honesty. Upon learning of their friend's misfortune, they agreed, in a pact of loyalty, to undertake the long journey to Uz. Their purpose was noble and clear, to have compassion on him and to comfort him.
They came armed with the intention of offering a shoulder to cry with, of weeping with those who weep, of bringing some relief to a soul in agony. But nothing, not even the most horrific stories they had heard, could have prepared them for the scene they encountered. As they approached what had once been Job's prosperous estate, they saw in the distance a figure sitting in the ashes, a silhouette hunched over in grief. For a moment, they doubted it could be him, the man they had known, the pillar of strength and dignity, the revered magnate, was gone. In his place was a specter of suffering, a body so disfigured with wounds, so consumed by anguish, that it was almost unrecognizable. The shock was so profound, so visceral, that their reaction was instantaneous and unanimous. They cried out loud, a wail that rent the air. In a gesture of shared mourning, they tore their own clothes and, gathering dust from the ground, threw it over their heads, covering themselves with the same symbol of desolation that enveloped their friend. In that moment, Job's pain became their pain. And then, faced with the vastness of that misery, they did the wisest and most compassionate thing they could. They fell silent. They sat on the ground beside Job, and there they remained for 7 days and 7 nights. Not a word was spoken. It was a heavy silence, a silence that acknowledged the inadequacy of human language to touch pain of that depth. It was the purest form of empathy, the presence that comforts without the need for explanations. During those 7 days, the only sound was the wind, and, occasionally, Job's muffled groan as he moved, as he scraped his wounds with the potsherd. Friends watched, their hearts surely aching with compassion. But the silence, though respectful, was also fertile ground for reflection, for the human attempt to find logic in chaos. And in their minds, the gears of theology began to turn. They saw the righteous sufferer, and instead of accepting the mystery, began to seek a cause. The seed of judgment, however well-intentioned, began to germinate in the soil of their convictions. At the end of that long week of silence, it was Job himself who broke the pact of muteness. But his voice brought no relief. It brought a cry that came from the depths of an existential abyss. He did not curse God, for his fear was still the anchor of his soul. But in an outpouring of absolute pain, he cursed the day he was born. "Perish the day I was born," he cried, "and the night in which it was said a man was conceived." He longed for non-being, the erasure of his own existence from the calendar of time. Why didn't I die when I came out of the womb? Why didn't I expire as soon as I was born? He envisioned death as a refuge, a place of peace where the weary finally rest, far from the burden of a life that had become unbearable. This deep lament, this expression of raw despair, was the trigger his friends had been waiting for. They interpreted the cry not as the outpouring of intolerable pain, but as proof that something was deeply wrong with Job's spirit. And Eliphaz, as the eldest, felt it was his duty to speak up and begin the process of healing, which in his view was a process of correction. He began with calculated gentleness, almost false modesty. "If anyone tries to speak to you, will you be weary? But who can hold back words?" He reminded Job of his past as a counselor, of how he strengthened the weak and lifted up the fallen. It was an introduction that subtly positioned him as superior, while simultaneously accusing him of failing to apply to himself the wisdom he imparted to others. And then came the first jab, disguised as a theological question. "Remember now, who is the innocent who ever perished,
And where were the upright destroyed? Eliphaz's premise, the basis of his entire argument, was the doctrine of retribution, an orderly and predictable worldview where God acts as a judge that rewards good and punishes evil immediately and visibly. If Job was suffering so spectacularly, the conclusion for Eliphaz was inevitable. There was a corresponding, albeit hidden, sin. To reinforce his point, Eliphaz shared a mystical experience, a night vision that would have taught him about human fallibility in face of divine holiness. He described how a spirit passed through him, making his hair stand on end, and whispered a transcendent truth. Is a man more righteous than God? Is a man purer than his Maker? With this rhetoric, he attempted to show Job that his self-justification was futile. Even if Job considered himself righteous in the eyes of men, before God's absolute perfection, he was inherently flawed and therefore deserving of correction. He concluded his first speech with advice that, on the surface, seemed pious. I would seek God and commit my cause to him. He exhorted Job to accept his suffering as discipline from a loving Father. Blessed is the man whom God corrects. Therefore, do not despise the discipline of the Almighty. But to Job, those words didn't sound like comfort. They sounded like an accusation. Eliphaz wasn't offering compassion. He was offering a diagnosis that declared Job guilty, turning his friends into prosecutors and his pain into the primary evidence of the crime. Job's loneliness intensified. He was surrounded by friends, but terribly alone in his truth.
Eliphaz's intervention, with its mixture of pity and accusation, fell on Job's wounded soul like salt on an open wound. He had expected compassion, an echo for his pain, but he had received a lecture. And when he finally responded, his voice was not one of submission, but of deep and justified frustration. He addressed not Eliphaz's theological arguments, but his lack of humanity. "Oh, that they would truly weigh my grief," he began, "and put my calamity in the balances together, for truly it would be heavier than the sand of the seas." Job was not asking for pity. He was trying to describe the indescribable, the crushing weight of a suffering that defied language. He felt that his friends, with their formulas and theories, were minimizing the reality of his agony. For him, what hurt most was not the arrows of the Almighty that he felt embedded in him, but the abandonment of those who should have sustained him. To the afflicted, a friend ought to show compassion, he declared, in a direct rebuke, even if he leaves the fear of the Almighty. It was a profound lesson about the nature of true friendship. Compassion precedes judgment. Even if Job were wrong, which he vehemently denied, a friend's duty would be to support, not to accuse. He compared the hope he had placed in his friends to a thirsty caravan searching for a stream in the desert, only to find it dry and broken. "My brothers have dealt treacherously with me, like a brook that overflows and passes away." The disappointment was palpable. They came to comfort, but their words became an additional burden. Job then defended himself against the implicit accusations. He challenged his friends to point out a specific error, a concrete sin he had committed. "Teach me, and I will hold my peace, and make me understand wherein I have erred." He did not see himself as a perfect man, but his conscience was clear. He had not oppressed the poor, nor denied justice, nor bowed to idols. His life had been an open book of integrity. His friend's insistence on a hidden sin was, to him, slander. Job's pain was multifaceted. The pain of loss, the physical pain, and now the pain of misunderstanding. He felt cornered, attacked from all sides. But the debate was just beginning. Bildad, the traditionalist, took the floor next, and his approach was even harsher and more tactless. He dismissed Job's lament as a rushing wind, empty words without substance. Bluntly, he presented his thesis. Does God pervert justice? Does the Almighty pervert justice? For Bildad, the universe operated with the precision of a moral clockwork. God's justice was automatic and infallible, and he didn't hesitate to apply this logic to Job's greatest pain. If your children have sinned against him, he has delivered them into the hand of their transgression. It was a statement of atrocious cruelty. He was saying, in no uncertain terms, that Job's 10 children died through their own fault, and by extension, if Job would purge himself of his own secret sins, God would surely restore his fortunes. Bildad's solution was simple. Confess, repent, and prosperity will return. He appealed to the wisdom of his ancestors, to the traditions passed down from generation to generation, as if the complexity of human suffering could be resolved by ancient proverbs. Then came Zophar, the most impatient and aggressive of the three. He accused Job of being a babbler, a man of multitude of words, who tried to justify himself with empty speeches. For Zophar, Job was not only guilty, he was also arrogant. With shocking presumption, he even claimed that God was being merciful. But know that God will exact less from you than your iniquity deserves. It was the height of cruelty. Not only was Job suffering for his sins, but his punishment was actually lighter than it should have been. Zophar spoke of God's unfathomable wisdom, higher than the heavens and deeper than the abyss, not to inspire humility, but to silence Job, to tell him he had no right to question. The cycle of accusations repeated itself, becoming increasingly explicit and severe. In later rounds of speeches, they moved from innuendo to direct accusations, listing sins they imagined Job had committed: oppression of the poor, denial of bread to the hungry, violence against widows and orphans. They painted a portrait of Job as a cruel hypocrite, whose public piety masked a life of exploitation. Amid this bombardment of judgments, Job felt increasingly isolated from others, but paradoxically increasingly focused on his true and only interlocutor, God himself. He realized that the tribunal of his friends was a sham. The justice he sought would not come from them. And so his cry became more intense, more direct, a plea that pierced the heavens in search of an answer. He longed for a mediator, he sought an arbitrator who could lay his hand upon him and upon God, so that he could present his case without being crushed by the divine majesty. And it was in this desert of loneliness, in this abyss of pain and incomprehension, that his faith produced its rarest and most enduring flower. He stopped looking at his accusers, lifted his eyes beyond his circumstances, beyond death itself, and made his immortal declaration of confidence. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and that at the last he will stand upon the earth. It was a burst of hope in the midst of despair. He knew not how, nor when, but he had the absolute conviction that someone, an avenger, a kinsman redeemer, would rise to his defense, that the truth of his life would not be buried beneath the accusations of his friends. And after my skin is destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God. I will see it for myself,
and my eyes will see it, and not another."
The cycle of debates between Job and his three friends had turned into a painful impasse. On one side, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, entrenched in their rigid theology, tirelessly repeated the same refrain: suffering is the direct consequence of sin. Unable to see beyond their simplistic logic and frustrated by Job's refusal to confess guilt he didn't possess, their speeches became increasingly hostile and their accusations more specific and unfounded. They had exhausted their proverbs, their traditions, and their supposed spiritual experiences. What began as a mission of consolation had degenerated into a dogged attempt to prove themselves right, even if it meant crushing the spirit of an already broken man. On the other side, Job, exhausted but unshakable in his integrity, refuted their arguments with the harsh realities of the world. He pointed to the prosperity of the wicked, to the injustice that often seemed to reign unchecked, dismantling the premise that divine justice operates predictably and immediately in this life. His cry, however, was no longer directed at them. He had realized the futility of seeking understanding from closed minds. His focus was heavenward, a desperate plea for an audience with the supreme judge, the only one who could vindicate his cause. The dialogue had reached a dead end. His friends fell silent, not because they had been convinced, but because they had nothing more to say. Job also fell silent, not for lack of arguments, but from exhaustion and the realization that his words were lost in the void. It was in this vacuum, in this silence filled with frustration and unresolved pain, that a new voice was heard, a voice no one expected. It belonged to a young man named Elihu, son of Barachel the Buzite. Until that moment, Elihu had remained a silent observer. Out of respect for the elder's age and supposed wisdom, he restrained himself, listening attentively to every speech, every retort, every accusation. But when he realized the debate had ended unresolved, he was filled with righteous indignation. He was angry with the three friends because, with all their wisdom, they had found no true answer and yet condemned Job. And he was angry with Job because, in his eagerness to defend his own righteousness, he justified himself, not God. His heart inflamed with a passion he could no longer contain, Elihu decided to speak. He began his speech with remarkable humility, acknowledging his youth. "I am a few days, and you are aged. Therefore I was afraid and feared to declare my opinion to you." But he quickly established that true wisdom is not a monopoly of age. Surely there is a spirit in man, and the breath of the Almighty gives him understanding. Elihu then offered a radically new perspective, a third way that neither Job nor his friends had considered. He criticized the three friends' central premise, the idea that suffering is merely punitive. But he also challenged Job's self-justification, suggesting that his view of suffering was limited. For Elihu, suffering could have a pedagogical and preventative purpose. God, he argued, uses affliction not necessarily to punish past sins, but to correct, to teach, to rescue the soul from future dangers. God speaks in one way or another, But man does not heed, Elihu declared. In a dream or in a vision of the night, he opens the ears of men and seals them with instruction, to turn away man from his counsel and to hide pride from man. He suggested that pain in the flesh, anguish in bed, could be the voice of God trying to get a man's attention, to deliver him from the pit and his soul from perishing by the sword. This was a revolutionary idea in the context of that debate. Suffering ceased to be merely the consequence of evil and became a potential instrument of good, a scalpel in the hand of the divine surgeon used to cut through a greater evil. Elihu extolled God's greatness and justice with a fervor others lacked. He stated categorically, "Far be it from God to do wickedness, and from the Almighty to commit iniquity." He defended God's absolute sovereignty, but not a capricious or indifferent sovereignty. Elihu's God was too great to be unjust and too powerful to be cruel. "Behold, God is great, and we cannot comprehend him." He invited Job to consider the wonders of creation, the clouds, the thunder, the snow, the rain, as evidence of a power and wisdom operating on a scale far beyond human comprehension. If we cannot understand how rain forms or why lightning splits the sky, how can we presume to understand God's purposes in human suffering? Elihu's speech was not an attack, but an invitation to humility. He did not accuse Job of specific sins as the others did. Instead, he exhorted him to stop focusing on his own innocence and began to ask himself what God might be trying to teach him through this ordeal. He changed the question from "Why am I suffering?" to "What can I learn from this suffering?" His speech was long and passionate, a bridge between human judgment and the divine revelation that was to come. He offered no easy answers, but opened a new window of possibility, one that allowed God to be just and Job to be righteous at the same time. He set the stage, silencing the flawed arguments of men and elevating the level of the conversation to the realm of God's sovereignty and mystery. And at the end of his speech, he pointed to the sky, to the phenomena of nature, as if he sensed what was about to happen. "Behold the wonders of God," he exclaimed. "With God is awesome majesty." Elihu's words hung in the air, charged with a new solemnity. The human voice had said all it could. Wisdom, tradition, passion, all had been exhausted. And it was then, at the end of the last human argument, that heaven itself decided to respond. The air began to stir, not with a gentle breeze, but with the force of an approaching power. A whirlwind began to form, a vortex of wind and dust that was not merely a meteorological phenomenon, but the chariot of the Creator's manifest presence. The answer Job had longed for was finally on its way. The human debate had ceased. The friends' arguments had exhausted themselves in their own presumption, and Elihu's passion had served as a solemn prelude to what was to come. The sky, once silent and indifferent blue, began to darken. The wind, once a mere whisper, gathered strength, transforming into a mighty howl that lifted the dust and ash around Job.
A whirlwind, a vortex of power and majesty began to form, not like an ordinary storm, but like the very epicenter of God's presence. It was the stage chosen by the Creator to finally break his silence. And from the heart of that storm, a voice emerged, a voice unlike any other, one that not only rang in the ears, but resonated in the soul, making the very ground tremble. It was the voice of the Lord. But the answer that came from the whirlwind was not what Job, in his anguish, had expected. There was no explanation for Satan's challenge. There was no fatherly consolation for their losses. There was no justification for their suffering. Instead, God's first statement was a cutting question that challenged the entire premise of human debate. Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? It was a firm correction, not to Job's pain, but to his presumption in judging the designs of the universe from his limited perspective. God was not invalidating his suffering, but his attempt to fit the infinite into his finite logic. Now therefore, gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. The Creator reversed the roles. The man who demanded answers would now be the one being questioned. What followed was one of the most majestic passages in all of sacred literature. God did not offer a theological sermon. He took Job on a tour of the vastness and complexity of his own creation. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Question after question, God unveiled the mysteries of the cosmos. Who established the planet's measures? Who laid its cornerstone while the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? Who shut up the sea with doors, saying, "Thus far shall you come, and no further, and here shall your proud waves be broken"? God spoke of the depths of the ocean, of the origins of light and darkness, of the treasures of snow and hail, which he stores up for the time of trouble. He questioned Job about the constellations. Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the bands of Orion? Each question was a brushstroke on a cosmic canvas, revealing a universe of order, power, and wisdom operating on a scale that made human concerns, though valid, infinitesimal in comparison. The lesson was clear. If you don't even understand the workings of the world you inhabit, how can you hope to understand the ways of your Creator? The divine tour continued through the realm of biology. God spoke of the lion hunting its prey, of the raven whose young cries for food. He spoke of the untamable freedom of the wild ass, of the strength of the wild ox that refuses to submit to the human plow. He described the apparent foolishness of the ostrich, which abandons its eggs but runs faster than the horse. He spoke of the courage of the war horse, which laughs at fear and charges into battle. He pointed to the instinctive wisdom of the hawk and the eagle. And then, to culminate his lesson on the power beyond human control, God described two magnificent and terrifying creatures, the behemoth, a herbivorous colossus of immense strength, and the Leviathan, an invincible sea monster whose sight terrifies the bravest of men. If man cannot master these creatures, how would he dare contend with the one who created them? God's answer was not an explanation, it was a revelation. The secret Job so desperately sought was not a why, but a who. God didn't tell him why he suffered. He showed Job who he was. And that vision, that manifestation of glory, power, and sovereignty was the only answer Job truly needed. Before that torrent of majesty, Job's soul bowed. All his reasoning, all his self-justification, all his longing for answers, all dissolved in the light of God's presence.
The man who had filled his mouth with arguments now placed his hand on it. "Behold, I am vile," he whispered. "What shall I say to you?" And when God pressed him to answer, Job's transformation was complete. His final words were not those of a defeated man, but of a man who finally saw. "I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted." And then the confession that sums up his entire journey. "I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes." His repentance was not for a sin that had caused his tragedy, but for his own smallness and presumption in questioning the infinite. He went from theoretical knowledge to personal knowledge.
The intimate experience. He saw God. With Job's transformation complete, God turned to the three friends, and his voice was one of stern rebuke. "My anger is kindled against you and against your two friends, because you have not spoken of me the right thing, as my servant Job has." Even in his lamentations and questions, Job's brutal sincerity was more acceptable to God than the pious but false theology of his friends. They were commanded to offer sacrifices and ask Job to pray for them. The man they condemned now became their intercessor. And the Bible records that the Lord turned the captivity of Job when he prayed for his friends. In the act of forgiveness came restoration. God not only restored, but gave Job double everything he had lost: new riches, new flocks, and most precious of all, a new family. 7 more sons and 3 daughters, whose beauty became legendary. Job lived another 140 years, a long and full life, and saw his descendants for 4 generations. He died old and full of days. Peace returned, but it was a different, deeper peace, forged in the fire of suffering and solidified in the revelation of God's glory. Job's secret was finally revealed. Faith thrives not in the absence of pain, but in the presence of God. And this presence is the greatest of all rewards. What do we learn from this epic journey through pain and revelation? We learn that the faith that survives is not the one that has all the answers, but the one that endures silence and trusts in the character of the one who remains silent. Job teaches us that suffering, though mysterious and often without apparent cause to us, is never beyond the sovereign control of a God who is both powerful and good. True victory lies not in the absence of trials, but in the ability to worship in the midst of them, to declare, "Blessed be the name of the Lord," when everything around us is in ruins. Job's story is an invitation to each of us. When we face our own whirlwinds, when logic fails and explanations disappear, we are called to do what Job finally did: stop trying to understand and simply begin to see. See the majesty, see the power, see the sovereignty, and trust that He who holds the universe in His hands also holds our wounded hearts. If this journey through Job's life touched your soul and awakened in you a new perspective on faith and suffering, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to our channel to continue exploring the profound truths of Scripture. Like this message so that it reaches others who may, right now, need to hear that there is hope even in the midst of the storm. On your screen, other videos with stories of transformation and overcoming will be available. Click and continue this journey of discovery. May Job's lesson resonate in your life,
reminding you always that God is present, even in the midst of the whirlwind.